Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the Your Forest podcast. I'm Matthew Christoph, and today I have Vic Lieffers on. Vic is a professor at the University of Alberta. He actually taught me advanced silviculture when I was in school. He's a very knowledgeable guy. He has a bachelor's in biology, PhD in plant ecology, and he's been involved in a lot of research, a lot of studies. He's been around a long time. He's a great guy to talk to. Just a wealth of information. He focused a lot on silviculture, which is growing back the forest and things along sustainable forest management. So he's been a huge help to the industry, and he's done a lot of good stuff. So he came on today to speak more broadly about forest harvesting and forest regeneration. So we talked about cutblocks and kind of the different types of cutblocks that exist, where we see things heading, where they were, how we've gotten better, how we can get better. It was a really good podcast for anybody that has their doubts about clear cutting or cutblocks. This might be a good podcast for you to check out, and you can really get to understand the entirety of it. I also have another person coming on in the future. She'll be coming on. She's an ecologist. She can speak to more the biodiversity of animals and insects and just the general biodiversity in relation to forest harvest and regeneration. So that'll be another down the line, end of the month here, I think, or beginning of February. So yeah, that'll be I guess part 2 of this one. So yeah, without any further ado, this is Vic and I. This podcast, for the most part, I wanted to get into cutblocks and sustainable forest management and talk about the way we do things and try and get people to understand that what we're doing is sustainable and why it's sustainable and some of the science that goes behind that. And you've got a lifetime worth of research to back that up. So I guess some of the misconceptions, like the main 4 that I've come across, the first one we talked earlier was like monocultures. A lot of people, they automatically assume that we're planting this, monoculture crop on the landscape, kind of like agriculture, and just kind of there's no biodiversity involved in it whatsoever. What would you have to say to something like that?
Well, in some cases there are monocultures, but in many of our forests are not. There are a range of different kinds of outcomes where we have conifer mixtures with deciduous, and but in some cases we do produce pure conifer stands, mm-hmm. and that's okay. I think as long as we start doing that in a way that looks at the whole landscape and the biodiversity of the landscape as well.
Right.
But certainly we are producing forests.
Yeah.
There is, in my opinion, in Alberta we have no issues with regenerating forests, mm-hmm. and we're doing a very good job, and the forest industry and government has got policies in place, a long list of regeneration requirements and regeneration standards, and forest industry is spending a lot of money and putting a whole lot of energy into regeneration of mm-hmm. forests. So when I hear people say that we are deforesting and getting rid of forests,
yeah,
and when we cut a forest that it's not growing again, I see red.
Right, and that's what I mean, right? People don't, and I think a lot of people that grew up maybe in the cities and stuff like that, or just never have spent much time out in the wilderness besides driving through Jasper or something, what they see from cutblocks is just the fresh cutblock. They don't notice that when it's 30 or 40 years grown back up. They don't notice that as a cutblock. They just think it is forest, right? But
right, they see the forest as being cut, and therefore it's gone forever, and right. That's certainly not the case. In Alberta, we're spending huge amounts of energy on regenerating forests. I got some data here nice. From 2015. Alberta planted 92 million seedlings in the province. And we cut about 96,000 hectares, and 63,000 of those hectares were planted.
Okay.
The rest of it came back naturally.
Right.
And they were probably aspen forests, or pine forests that were where we treated the forest and the natural seed regenerated the forest.
Yeah.
Alberta's got a whole long list of regeneration standards that have been in place for a long time that demand that we regenerate forests. And if they don't get regenerated, there is a penalty to be paid.
Yeah.
And
there's laws behind the whole thing keeping us. But even besides the laws, it's also, I think most modern foresters today have an ethical issue with doing something that's going to leave the forest lesser than it was, right? But it's there's also laws to make sure that those things happen for sure.
There are laws, and I think the average forester, the majority of foresters want to do the right job, want to do the right thing, and they fulfill the requirements of the law. Yeah, and the law says you have to do it. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's any doubt that we are regenerating forests.
No, absolutely. So, and I think, like speaking to monoculture specifically, I think the idea that I've heard people say is they think it's genetic monocultures, right? So they think that we're planting, say we cut a spruce stand, we plant a spruce stand, and that every spruce tree is just a clone of the other spruce tree. I think they think that might be the case, whereas my understanding is that with seed zones and that that's not necessarily true. That's not true. There's a lot of genetic diversity within the spruce themselves.
Yeah, there is a lot of genetic diversity, and there's even where the seed comes from seed orchards. Mm-hmm. There are a wide variety of different mothers and fathers within that seed orchard.
Right.
And there's a lot of crossbreeding, so there's still a lot of genetic diversity going out in the seed lots that are being planted.
Right, and not just that, but they're also the genes that are being planted are from that region as well. It's not like they're planting genes from northern Alberta and southern Alberta, right?
Correct.
Right. So that's another huge thing. I think that people along the monoculture route, people think that we just kind of go about it in a productive standpoint. It's all about productivity no matter what. And I think that's what I'm trying to get through with this episode is kind of that these things are all done for very specific reasons. There's so much research and science being done. And I just want to kind of get those points out there. So,
well, there's no question we are regenerating forests, and they're coming back and growing. Yeah. And for instance, I took the students on a field tour in my silviculture class this fall that were on sites that were planted 28 years ago.
Okay.
And I remember them being planted.
Oh yeah.
Very distinctly. With relatively poor planting stock.
Oh, really?
That was a characteristic. And this is one of the situations is that the average forester and even the professors spent a large part of their life, the early part of the 1980s and 90s, thinking that we had really a great difficulty growing trees.
Yeah,
and there were a lot of reasons for that. Notably, we had very poor planting stock.
Okay.
In 1980,
it was just a roll of the dice.
It was stock that we didn't have the recipes down for growing it, and a lot of it was partially dead by the time we put it in the ground.
Oh, I see. So not necessarily just from the genetics, but also from the handling and stuff?
Yeah, exactly. So in those years, we had quite significant plantation failures.
Oh, really? I didn't know.
And we would lose half of our growing stock in many cases. And there was a genuine problem with regenerating forests in those days. Huh. That's not true anymore.
Yeah.
We've got the recipe for growing the stock. And then secondly, we're also using vegetation management techniques that give the seedlings a lot of opportunities to take full advantage of the sites. If anything, I would say now we're too good at it.
Yeah,
and I think you have to tell that to say that in an odd way because especially
what do you mean by that? I guess,
especially right? to people who think that we are deforesting.
Yeah.
We're not deforesting. We're probably too good at it because in some cases we are growing very, very dense forests of white spruce that are that are probably overstocked.
Yeah.
And there's too little opportunity for light to get to the understory.
Yeah.
To get understory vegetation to develop.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of de-density. By de-density meaning, just heavily, very little sunlight getting through spruce stands that I've seen out there that are growing up really, really productively. So
yeah, well, white spruce is one of these trees that has a lot of leaf area. Leaf area meaning the amount of leaves that the tree carries, and so a spruce tree and an aspen tree of equal size. Mm-hmm. The spruce tree will have 3 times as much shading capacity as the aspen.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And therefore, it's really hard on understory vegetation.
Right. Yeah, and that's something we want to keep up for a variety of reasons. Right. We want to make sure that these forests are coming back as natural as we can make them come back to. Right. We want to make sure that biodiversity is kept. So speaking to that, I guess, talking about shade tolerant and shade intolerant species and stuff, maybe we can talk a little bit about like the different types of cutblocks that are different types of harvesting methods that we use. Maybe you can speak a little bit to the EMEN study and some other stuff that's going on there.
Well, most of the forests in Alberta have been clear cut,
right?
And in the last 30 years, most of it has been in that way, mm-hmm. And it works really well for. Like I say, we can get really good regeneration of both aspen forest in that way and spruce forest in that way.
Pine too, I would imagine,
and lodgepole pine.
Yeah.
Again, we have very little problem in our current management systems of getting regeneration of all these forests. Mm-hmm. So that's not an issue. There are some opportunities though of getting different kinds of forest structure, and we're currently leaving some mature trees on the forest called variable retention harvesting, where perhaps 10 to 15% of the mature trees are left on the forest.
Right. In different types of, maybe there's single tree standing, or maybe it's a group, like a patch.
Exactly. They could be in patches. And the idea is that it would simulate what would happen after a wildfire.
Right.
The wildfire would burn continuously on some parts of the landscape, and then skip some sections of forest, and then burn some more,
leaving snags, leaving all kinds of,
and leaving living patches and mature trees in clusters and occasionally in singles,
right,
across the landscape. So we're doing this quite a bit on our land, on our forests, and I think we could do even more of it with a particular kind of forest structure that we have in the boreal forest, where we have maturing aspen with partially grown understory spruce, spruce that are below the canopy of the aspen, and we should be doing more logging that would protect these kinds of forests.
Yeah, understory protection. Yeah.
Yeah, where we would cut the aspen and not damage the understory spruce. It's pretty tricky to do this. It takes quite a skill to be able to cut down a large aspen tree and not damage the vulnerable and fragile half-grown spruce below it.
No, exactly.
But it can be done.
Yeah.
And
we're just getting into that kind of the science behind doing that, I suppose, right? Like,
well, the science has actually is pretty old now.
Pretty solid, yeah.
Pretty solid. Like even Lorne Brace, for instance, one of the old foresters from 1980, he was describing this in 1980.
Oh, really? That
we should be doing more of this kind of approach to mixed wood management.
Right.
And
you don't think it's being done? I mean, I personally, I don't think it's being done very widely right now. I think it's being experimented with by companies and that, but you might know more about that than I do.
It's not being done widely. There's several long long reasons for this. Maybe that would be for another lecture.
Well, cost is one thing, right? Like it's very cost intensive. We're not used to that. We don't have a huge margin of error in forestry, so everything's very tight. So that's a big one, I would imagine.
Cost is part of it, and part of it is another oddity that we have in forestry is that we sometimes have two different landowners or two different kinds of entities who want the wood from the forest.
Right. Different species or whatever.
And different species. So we call this land-based designations. And so there are conifer companies.
Yeah.
And Alberta has put together a situation where we've got a deciduous company wanting the deciduous wood
on the same land base.
On the same land base as the conifer company.
And what do you manage for? You have to do both, but how do you? Yeah.
Exactly. This creates all kinds of tensions and perhaps missed opportunities because of conflicts that occur because of these kinds of arrangements.
But it seems like it's slowly making its from the conversations that I've had with there's supervisors and other foresters and that it seems like they want to start implementing these things, these types of harvesting strategies whether it's a shelter wood or strip cuts or patch avoidance or trying to protect understory, right? But it seems they're not 100% confident in the methodology, or it's just new. They don't want to stick their necks out there, maybe, right? Maybe that might be the problem. But I feel like it's becoming more widely talked about, more widely accepted, and I think I imagine it's probably going to start happening a lot more now. I would hope that at some point it'll become the norm. Right? It seems to be a well, we don't know for sure. I guess I don't know, but it seems like it's a pretty moral way to be harvesting forests. Right?
Well, I would hope it would become the norm too, because but if anything, I don't think we've gone in that direction in the last decade.
No, okay.
I think it's gone to reverse.
Really, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and it's that being said.
Yeah.
That being said, I think there's still great opportunities, and one of the things that maybe we could talk about just briefly would be the EMEN study.
Yep.
And that's a very large study that was set up in 1998. It was established by John Spence, Jan Bolney, Tim Vingy, Steve Luchko.
Bunch of people.
And it was with University of Alberta and Canadian Forestry Service and Dayashawa and Canfor. They set up this large cutting experiment where they cut the forest in leaving various amounts of residual trees. We were able to establish, and the main objective, I think, was to look at the biodiversity of the forest. And I'm not the expert on the biodiversity aspects of it, but I can tell you about some of the regeneration and some of the tree responses, because I did study that.
Yeah, yeah.
And we underplanted. We planted spruce. This was with Derek Sitters from the Canadian Forestry Service.
Okay.
Underplanted white spruce and in these forests, and we looked at the growth of these trees in the last 15 years.
Right. Post removal of whatever amount of aspen, overstory aspen. Okay.
Right. And so they were, sometimes we planted into almost full grown spruce stands.
Right.
Or planted into brand new cutover areas that had been clear cut.
Okay.
And we found that we had some really good success in this experiment in terms of the spruce. It turns out the best place to grow, where you're not going to use any vegetation control or herbicides, the best place to grow spruce is when you have 50% of the mature aspen.
50% is the number, magical number.
That's what we found. We found excellent growth of spruce in those circumstances.
So they appreciate some shade. We know that they're a shade tolerant species, but they also grow light in full, or grow well in full sun. But it seems like, so you see the best release is in kind of somewhere in the middle there.
The best growth was in the middle.
Okay.
When there was aspen overstory.
Right.
On the forest.
Okay. Interesting.
That's when you don't use vegetation control.
Right. So herbicides and
no herbicides were used in this experiment. So
Right.
this, and they grew as in the same ballpark as what you would find in well-tended plantations.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I've
we
seen a cross section of a tree in one of the experimental scup blocks up in near Slave Lake. A cross section of it, and it looked to me like the volume almost doubled in like a quarter of the time or something like that from when it was released. Right, like the growth was, let's say it was a 30-year-old tree, and the first 15 years it was 2 inches across, and the next 5 years it was 6 inches across, and it seemed like the growth was just ridiculous after that aspen canopy was partially removed. So
removing part of the aspen canopy and not all of it seems to be the right recipe.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we found in that big experiment, we were able to look at the aspen regeneration across the whole experiment.
Right.
And aspen is one of those species that likes to be in the open.
Full sun, yeah.
Full sun. Mm-hmm. Anytime especially when you left some of the mature aspen on the site, it actually had the lower density of response, and the trees didn't grow as well.
Right.
In those circumstances.
Which was kind of we would expect,
Yeah,
right?
That's what you'd expect from a shade intolerant tree.
Yeah. So I guess I can quickly just describe so shade intolerant species are like aspen, poplar, pine, generally speaking, and shade tolerant. You're looking at more the firs and spruce that are they're willing. They grow well in that kind of situation. Like, I mean, I've seen balsam fir trees that are 2 meters tall, and you cut them down and realize that they're 40 years old. They've just been waiting for an opportunity to grow, right? So they're a pretty resilient tree. It's interesting.
Well, it's the same with white spruce. Some of them, sometimes they can only be 2 meters tall and 40 years old.
Yeah, they just hold out, wait for that opportunity, right? They're pretty incredible species. Yeah,
if they grow in very, very dark conditions.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess. I guess you can speak. Yeah, you can really speak to the growing conditions for these different factors. So, what are some of the other considerations when we're talking about using an understory protection harvesting method versus a clear cut? Like, what would you say, just off the kind of top of your head, what the benefit is of that? Besides we think it looks more like a natural disturbance, right?
It looks more like a natural disturbance, and I think you've got when you do understory protection, you should have a situation where you would get more of a I guess diversity of forest structure, meaning you have different sizes of trees, different ages of trees in the forest, and for some species of wildlife, this is a real advantage.
Huge, yeah.
And others don't really need that.
Right.
But there will be some that will view this as perfect habitat for themselves.
Right. So, for example, I guess I'm bringing Ellen in at some point too, and she can speak more to that side of it. But the science has been proven that this is a better way to do it than clear cutting. This takes into account more values than just the forest productivity.
It does take into account more values than forest productivity. Mm-hmm. I don't want to leave the listeners with the idea that growing a pure stand of spruce is a bad thing.
Right.
And I don't want anybody to believe that I think that either. But if you grew it everywhere, it's a bad thing.
Of course. Right.
And growing pure dense spruce stands everywhere would be a bad thing if that's the only thing we did.
Right, which is not what we're doing, but it's
yeah.
Like right now, I guess I can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of regrowing back stock after you've harvested is that you replant the same composition as what you cut. Right, so you cut a mixedwood spruce aspen forest, you're going to try and regrow a mixedwood spruce and aspen forest. Is that correct? Or
that's the current standards? Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And ecologists might argue about that too.
Well, that's the successional planting, and that's a whole nother thing for sure.
Yeah,
but it's
because when you look at the way that in the boreal forest, the way most spruce stands developed, the spruce grew up underneath an aspen stand.
Right.
That's how they developed.
And then slowly the spruce will catch up to the aspen. The aspen kind of falls over when it hits 100 and something years old. It gets rotten, and then the spruce take over.
The aspen has a shorter lifespan than the spruce.
Yeah.
And falls out.
Right. What is that push like? Because I've always wondered about that. Recently, I've talked to a few people about that issue exactly. Right. Currently, we replant exactly what we removed. But say we remove a mixedwood spruce stand, do you think that we'll get to a point that maybe we'll just plant a spruce stand because that's the next successional step? Or the problem I guess there is the science needed to prove that that's the right thing to do would take 100 years to sort out, I imagine, because you need to.
Well, we do know that we can grow spruce in pure stands now.
Right.
We didn't know that 30 years ago, and so there were a lot of people who were wringing their hands saying, oh gosh. And we had a federal government program called FERDA, which was developed in the late 70s and 80s because we weren't regenerating spruce and conifers across Canada. Mm-hmm. This program was put in place to reestablish conifer forests.
Right.
So we genuinely had a big problem. And so a whole generation of foresters were actually, and foresters and policymakers were anxious to make sure that we kept our spruce in our landscape. Mm-hmm. A whole generation were trained this way.
We're worried, yeah.
And now I think we're overshooting the mark.
Right.
To be quite honest.
Interesting. Huh.
Because by God, we're successful now.
Yeah.
And we're overshooting the mark.
Yeah.
And so it's a interesting situation, and it's hard for us to realize, gee, maybe we can back off a bit.
Right. Like you said, we're getting too good at it. So it's actually it's too good to the point where we really need to take stock of what's going on and really make sure that we're doing the right thing and not producing these an abundance of one type of species. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. So I guess we could talk forever. I got so many questions. We could go on for hours, but I want to try and keep this focused on something. I guess some of the other misconceptions that I run across all the time, right? So we talked about monocultures and deforestation, not the case. And then was permanent environmental damage. So some people think that it's causing like soil erosion, increased soil erosion, or what did I write down? Just decreased species diversity in general, right? And again, I'm going to have an ecologist on to speak about the species diversity more in depth later on. But can you speak to the kind of the erosion part of it a bit?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about erosion because I think there's actually, when you clear cut a forest, mm-hmm. The forest you left the forest floor in place. Mm-hmm. It's the thick layer of organic matter and roots and embedded roots. You leave that in place when you clear cut. And as a consequence, rainfall doesn't really touch it very much. For instance, if you burnt it instead and burnt it deep with a hot fire, you would burn it right down to mineral soil, and there would be a soil erosion more likely to occur at that point.
Right, because everything's loose.
After fires than clear cutting. So I keep telling my students, soil erosion is not an issue in modern forestry, except for one way. Okay. And that is road building. Road building and concentrated skidding can sometimes start to channel water and channel the water and you have you get erosion from that.
Concentrated skidding meaning you're
dragging the logs
in one exact place continuously.
Right.
Okay.
And those are the places where you can have significant erosion.
Right.
But if the roads are reclaimed properly, and increasingly that's happening, the roads that are put in inside of a cutover area, where trucks go on temporarily, they would reclaim these roads with plows and deep soil compaction techniques.
Right.
And then
to try and remove the soil compaction and make it viable for seed, right?
Make it viable for roots to penetrate the soil again.
Right.
And then put organic matter, pull the organic matter that was pushed aside during the road building, pull it back onto the road. You can actually have some really good results of getting these roads reclaimed.
Yeah.
And increasingly that's being done across the landscape. And that's a really good thing for biodiversity reasons as well, to get the roads out of the landscape, because, I was reading in the paper this morning, there's an article about roads being the major problem for grizzly bears.
Right.
And
the linear disturbance.
Linear disturbances and having people get into the forest.
Yeah. It makes it easier for all kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's an issue with caribou, it's an issue with grizzly bears. It just makes sense. Yeah.
Right. So if you can get rid of the roads, you're probably going to get rid of the erosion potential if you do it properly. And increasingly, it's done very well. Yeah. Lots of energy and money being spent on this.
Yeah.
Then you can have some good things happening to get rid of roads.
Yeah. No, and that makes sense. Even though, like, considering that it's good for biodiversity, it's good for the environment, it's good for it's morally sound practices. It's also, even just from an economic perspective or a financial perspective, why would you want to allow that piece of land to be removed from your land base or growing stock, right? This way you can plant trees and you're still growing more trees, where if you didn't reclaim it, you'd literally be missing that piece of.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. These are fully recovered.
And that's a lot when you think about how much road covers. When you're doing cut blocks, the percentage, it's got to be a couple percent.
It can be between 2% and 5%.
Right.
Maybe it's not supposed to be, but on small cut blocks it might be more than that.
Right. So you want to make sure that is reclaimed, so that you can have growing stock come back, rather than just having a bunch of alder pop up and it be kind of
or grasses or an eroded ditch.
Just a big hole in the ground. Yeah, exactly. That's we want to be avoiding that for sure.
You want to avoid that, because that's where you get the stream damage, the sedimentation, and the ideas that logging is bad.
Yeah.
Is the times where you have the worst cases of that is when roads are not managed properly.
Right. Yeah. So soil erosions. Yeah, that's the thing, right? I don't know where that misconception came from. I guess people just assumed that when you cut a cut block, you go through with a dozer and you just kind of push everything over and get rid of all the soil, and then you have bare mineral soil. But that's not good for anything. Why would we do that, right? It would be
don't.
Yeah, and like you said, even with fires, right? Like even
fires can do a lot of erosion.
Oh yeah,
and can create a lot of erosion.
Well, especially with the hydrophobic properties of burnt organic matter, right? It just everything just flows right off it and probably picks up speed even. So it's no, it makes sense. It makes total sense. I'm glad we could get rid of that one. The last kind of main misconception I was running into was, and I guess I could see where people got this misconception. It's not that far fetched, but it was decreased carbon sequestration in the cut blocks. So I think their assumption is that we've got these big trees on the landscape. They're pulling in a lot of carbon, and they're not releasing it into the atmosphere as much as. And as soon as you cut it, all of a sudden they're not doing that. But my understanding is that's not true at all. In fact, that you might be increasing by having new vegetation growing up.
Well, you're going to temporarily cause a reduction in carbon storage when you clear cut.
Right.
So that particular piece of land, you're hauling away the big logs, and there's a lot of carbon in those big logs.
Yeah. But that carbon is being stuck in that lumber. It's not like it's being burnt in a full
right.
fire.
Right. Provided that the carbon is put into sawn timbers, and it's used in housing and long-term long-term products, you can actually have quite a significant carbon storage. The beauty of that is if you were intelligent about it, even at the end of the life cycle, you would collect that wood and burn it in a power plant and then generate energy that would offset fossil fuel consumption for.
And that's happening more and more, it seems like. So
it has the potential to be done more and more.
Yeah.
However, you put it in a landfill and don't collect the methane that comes out of it, that's bad.
Right.
That would be a bad situation.
Yeah, the landfill's not the best thing. Yeah.
Although if you collect the methane and put it through and use it for something useful, then it's okay.
Right.
And that's happening increasingly too. Methane is being collected. But there is, I think people if are interested in carbon and forest should look at the State of Canada's forest, the last one, 2017. There are really some really neat graphs that were produced by the Canadian Forestry Service from Victoria.
Got that in my office, actually, yeah.
That show that insects and diseases, fire, and years with big fire years, like for instance in 2017, the British Columbia fire, we probably are releasing way more carbon from those kinds of activities and those kinds of things that are happening to the forest than forest management.
Right.
And forest management actually can be, if you use wood in these long-term storage products and you offset fossil fuel consumption, you don't produce concrete or steel, as much concrete or steel, because you've used a wooden building instead of a concrete or steel building, then you are really making some big progress.
Yeah, big time.
So it's kind of an eye-opener.
Yeah.
And I think forestry has got some real advantages. Really, it's going to be viewed much more positively by environmentalists than it has been in the past when we start doing a carbon analysis.
I agree.
A full-scale analysis of the carbon life cycle analysis of forestry operations compared to many other products that we're using in our society.
Yeah. Well, I had a whole podcast with Dalbar Hudek. You know Dalbar from FP Innovations.
Yeah.
And we discussed exactly that. We discussed the carbon or the resources that go into making concrete or steel versus wood, and the carbon sequestration and all that, and the wood comes out on top every time, right? It's just better. And not just that, it's a truly sustainable resource. It's like one of the only ones we have on the planet, and we can just keep growing it. And we were, like you said, we're getting good at it. So it's
as long as we manage it properly and carefully, and don't do stupid things like leaving roads that erode, and we can do very well with forestry. Yeah,
no, I agree. And one other thing was that what I read about the carbon sequestration with a cutblock is, like you said, when you initially remove the older growth, you have a temporary loss of carbon sequestration from the atmosphere. But my understanding is that with the new growth coming up in whatever 5 years or however long it takes to get to a certain amount, you have a higher density of those trees, first of all, than you did before, and they're consuming carbon at a rate that perhaps a climax stand was not, right? That carbon sequestration is actually increased compared to the old stand.
Yeah, like this, for instance, when I was showing the students that 30-year-old spruce stand, that probably is at its maximum time of carbon fixation.
Right.
Is at that point.
At 30 years old.
At 30 years old.
Not at 100 years old.
Not at 100, not at 150.
Yeah.
It's probably, in terms of what's going into the wood.
Right.
That's
carbon,
it's probably reaching its point of maximum wood production.
Meaning it's going to start having stem exclusion and trees are going to die, releasing their carbon.
It's already at stem exclusion.
Yeah.
It's at that stage where it's fully loaded up with leaves.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting the carbon aspect of forestry is something that really intrigues me, and I've been trying to find people to come on and discuss carbon. I've talked about it a little bit. We had a guy on to talk about biochar. We talked about that a bit and its application maybe with forestry or at least with residuals from forest products. But yeah, there's a lot to discuss there, and I find it really fascinating to I'm curious if we can manage the forest for carbon sequestration additionally to other things. I mean, or if it's just kind of a result of doing good forest management. It's
results of good. Certainly, we're going to be fixing more carbon if we have regenerative forests.
Yeah,
we will be.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah,
awesome. Yeah, I guess we talked. You're talking about growing trees, getting better. And yeah, I guess just the approach. I guess just talking about generally the approach of like where we've been to where we are now. I think it's nothing but good news to point out that when we first started this, we were just removing, 100 years ago, we were just removing the big fat trees and turning them into lumber and not really regrowing. You're just kind of removing them and then slowly edging our way into something that's more emulating natural disturbance and more natural and has less of an impact, total impact, right? So,
well, there's certainly we're really good at growing trees.
Yeah.
We're really good at growing trees these days, and we've got a whole mechanism and a whole infrastructure in place that regenerates our forests.
Yeah,
and we have a government that wants to get that done, and an industry that's going along with it and doing a good job doing that.
Yeah.
As I said before, though, I think in some cases we're overdoing it.
Yeah,
we're producing some cases too dense a stands,
right,
and too good at growing spruce, which is if I would have been told that 25 or 30 years ago, I wouldn't have believed it.
Yeah,
I wouldn't have believed we'd be at this stage, but here we are.
Yeah, I guess it's in a way, compared to the opposite problem, it's a good problem to have. I think it's easier to dial things back than it would be to try and ramp them up. So I guess it's interesting that we've gotten to a point where we're so good at growing back stock that it's actually become an issue, and now we have to rethink it a little bit. But
well, we probably are in the right place, because I think it's going to be dialed back for us by the issues related to biodiversity and caribou. Mm-hmm. Caribou will demand that we have more extensive management and more less intensive kinds of approaches to management on fairly significant parts of the landscape. Mm-hmm. That would give us opportunities to do intensive management on other parts of the landscape.
Yeah.
And that's probably where we'll end up.
Yeah.
And so having those wonderful tree growing skills it will be a real advantage to that more intensive part of the landscape.
Yeah.
And I think we're going there. We may not have planned it that way, but that's probably how we'll end up.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I think with the society becoming more aware of their surroundings and becoming more aware of the issues that play with climate change and with the headwaters being an issue and all kinds of different, everyone's more aware of these charismatic megafauna like grizzly bears and caribou, and people are more worried about fish and water quality and all these types of things. I think the internet only increases the demand for us to make sure that we're managing for those values, right? And making sure. And I think I think we're only going to get better. It seems like.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think we have a thing called a proposal called the triad approach, where we'd be managing the land, the forest lands, on the basis of very intensive forestry on a small portion of the land or a portion of the land.
Right.
Then extensive management, where we would try to be managing more using natural processes.
Okay.
And then we would have another portion of the land that would be reserves, where we wouldn't have any management at all.
Right.
And I think our park system and reserve areas come close to fulfilling that need. Mm-hmm. And I suspect our extensive management is going to be lands that we zone for these critters like caribou and headwaters, protecting headwaters and other things like that.
Yeah. No.
And then we'll have to find these other places where we can really grow trees.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. No, I think you're totally right. It just seems like I think the forest industry as a whole is in a transition period where I think we're going to be held very accountable to all of these values and making sure that they're all being held properly for future generations and everything. And I think it's going to be interesting to see where we go as a profession and as an industry and what the people demand of us, right? So it's going to be, I'm very curious to see how things turn out, but I think all things point to the positive in at least in my limited opinion.
Yeah. No, I think having skills to grow trees is a very good thing, considering the climate change and the carbon issues, and the desire to have industries and towns that in rural communities that have sustainable jobs.
Yeah.
So that's all good.
Sustainable jobs being the key point there, not temporary. Yeah.
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 Sustainable and good jobs.
Yeah, exactly.
So
awesome.
Those are all wonderful things.
Yeah, this is a perfect podcast. Do you have? I just want to ask one final thing. I generally ask people if they have any kind of final concluding thoughts, anything they want to wrap up or mention at all, or if you're good, you're good too. We can also shut her down. I think we've had a pretty interesting. We've come up a lot of questions for people. For sure.
I think we are doing. We're doing very well.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly how much of the other. If we didn't have caribou and headwaters to worry about, I'd be really worried right now that we're way overshooting.
We're gonna keep going. Yeah.
But I think given those other circumstances, we're probably not.
Yeah.
Probably about at the right place.
Yeah. So the correct issues are being focused on. So that's good.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for coming on. I think we gave people a lot to think about. My brain was going off on tangents to like, no, focus, because there's a million things to talk about around these things, right? So,
okay. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. If anybody has any questions, they can email me at yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and I will get the answers for you, either from Vic or through research or whatever I have available to me. If anybody out there is listening, I really appreciate it if you'd rate and review, subscribe. It's all good. Helps me out a lot. Lets me know what everybody likes. And you'd be surprised at how much it helps. So thanks a lot for listening. We'll talk to you guys next time.